Um, this is the presentation and just the, sorry. Yeah, so here it is. And just to give you a brief outline of what we are doing today is we will talk about the rationale for our study, and we will talk a little bit more about what cultural sports psychology is, and Scott will discuss critical race theory in sport. We'll discuss our findings, and we will briefly talk about what's next, and there are many steps that we can take. So as for the rationale, Scott and I have met, I guess it was a couple of years ago already, at one of the conferences here in Eastbourne at the University of Brighton. And we have talked a lot about our research, which actually explores the topic of basketball players, Black American basketball players. And we talked more about the racism in sport, and we decided that we can actually explore the institutionalized racism in sport a little bit more, merging both of our expertise as a sports psychologist in my case and a sociologist of sport in Scott's case through those interracial relationship between coaches and athletes. I will talk a little bit more about cultural term in sports psychology a little bit later, but just to give you a spoiler alert, we are arguing for the racial term as well. And the main statement, the main kind of point we would like to argue for is to encourage all practitioners, whether it is coaches, sports psychologists, agents, and so on, to take a more active anti-racism stance.
So when we looked at this, one of the things that struck us, I'd given a presentation where I talked about the rules and how rules were applied unevenly and unequally to different players, and how race played, could be a part of this when you're studying it. So thinking of how players of different racial backgrounds, particularly Black athletes on a team with white athletes, might be pigeonholed into certain positions, certain roles. We talk about things like winning white as an example. It's historical, but also seems to be current, and you'll get a glimpse of this in our study. And so that was the way that we connected. And then I wanted to start with the presumption that race was real. And so in that, let's take a look at some global examples. Why don't you go ahead and get us to the next slide, Anastasiya? And so, in this current moment, we know what's going on with Black Lives Matter, with these terrible deaths, these killings of Black folks in the United States. We can move to the next slide. And then, just as Daniel just spoke about, right, there are these examples where you can see how racism is global. It's not simply something that's happening in the States. Daniel just gave us an example and featured Ini Aloku's and the situations with her coaches, her having to deal with them mocking a Jamaican accent. She's not even Jamaican. And then talking about the threat of her being a foreigner, right? So her family perhaps bringing Ebola and threatening the health of others. Raheem Sterling, he also referenced. We can go back to Mario Balotelli, the Italian who has faced numerous chants at home in Italy as well as abroad. And then you can see the far right that we also see happening in European soccer or football. And so, racism is global, and this was a moment to start with racism is real. All right, next slide. And so, another way of thinking about it, or to push it even further, is that racism is of course intersectional. So here we have Caster Semenya and what she has gone through from international federations, them enacting policies with racist implications. Not only are we talking about Caster, but we're also can point at two other very high profile cases of women who have been banned from competition in track and field. And when you look at their skin complexion, you see that they are also dark-skinned women. Both of the others, Duty Chand is one of them, and Santhi, and I'm going to mispronounce her last name, but both of them are Indian, of Indian descent. And yet, this is something that happens across the board in multiple countries. It happens at very interactional levels and individual racism. It also happens, Daniel talked about the cultural racism in terms of statues and these figures that highlight a white superiority. And then we also have how it happens at an institutionalized level through these federal policies that are banning these women of dark skins, right? And also from lesser developed, actually, Castor is from South Africa, so not necessarily lesser developed, but as we say, from the global South. Next slide. So here's another example getting us closer to our research, and this is a basketball-related example. And here we have, after Tel Aviv Maccabi, a historic franchise in terms of basketball, global basketball, they win a championship. And their response from one of the ministers of sport is that yes, congratulations, but some people were unhappy that the team played with 5 Kushim throughout much of the game. And so Kushim goes back to Kush, going back to the continent of Africa, going back to, black people there. And this was, in some ways, people will argue about whether or not it is exactly an equivalent to the N-word, but it was definitely a racial slur. And this gets us to the idea of winning white, right? So in this context, Tira was saying people were upset that we didn't win with our own, right? That we were winning with these outsiders. Next slide, Anastasiya, thank you. And then we've got another example. And here with Lithuania basketball, the president of the team, and I want to draw your attention to a few key things, right? We've always held a stance that there shouldn't be more than, right? And this is part of how we got our title for the presentation. Shouldn't be more than 2 black players on the team. And then you get, as he describes the coach, right? The coach is there to control them, to teach them, to tutor them, right? So this is an aspect of the relationship. And then he describes what happened in the team, in the formation. And he uses the word that the black players came together and formed a gang, right? And then he extends it to giving us a greater institutionalized framework. So it's not just that this is his feelings. He says, I can say that from my 23 years of experience in the business, teams don't ever have more than 2 black players. And then because that's when bad things start to take place. All right, next slide, Anastasiya.
Right, thank you. So far it's working well, given the presentation at the different locations, sharing slides. So here we come to the sports psychology part of the presentation. And culture, race has been talked about quite a lot in sports psychology. Maybe not as much as it should have, but hopefully we will change the situation. But the main so-called cultural turn in sports psychology happened about 10 years ago when great scholars published several books and articles about the need and the urge for actually exploring race and culture in sport and taken into account, as well as all the different marginalized groups, different cultural identities. Cultural sports psychology, though, perceives race and ethnicity as 2 phases of culture, and we will be arguing later on today that we will need to look at race more separately in this case. Immigration of athletes has been quite well researched very recently in sports psychology. And there is an extended research on this topic of acculturation of immigrated athletes. And I'm sure that the slides will be shared with you later, so you can check those articles yourself. For the sake of the time today, I'm just going to very briefly go through some of the studies. And basically, when we talk about the interracial coach-athlete relationship, it's not a secret that it has been quite well researched that racial backgrounds of players have an impact on coaches' expectations and behavior towards the athletes. And very rightfully so, it has been argued that culture blind approach does not work in sport and puts relationship between coaches and athletes at risk. And the more, as a coach, the more you're aware of your athlete's culture and the background, where they're coming from, the better it is for your relationship. Unfortunately, there are still plenty of racial stereotypes in sport, as of black athletes are quite lazy and they don't want to do much or train hard. And it still exists, and our research will show that it is still happening. And some of the studies focused on the formation of ethnic subgroups and culturally diverse teams. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. So we started with assume that racism is omnipresent and it's global. And really this is an attempt to extend some previous work that I've done with other colleagues. So there is a growing movement. It's not new to use critical race theory and apply it to sport. But what I've tried to do is create this sport crit framework. And so beyond taking pieces of critical race theory or just continuing to talk about it devoid of sport and how it may manifest itself specifically in sport, I've put forth this sport crit that really does put it right in the middle of a sport and how it operates. And so, we've got a few different important pieces. It challenges. So you start with racism is omnipresent and global. Racism is this mix with other isms, right? Sexism, heterosexism, xenophobia. We can think of all the other kinds of oppressions, but it's about these things are intersecting. There's a challenge to white privilege and ideological claims that sport outcomes can be explained by objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity, right? Critical race theory and sport crit as well seeks to ameliorate racism. We have a commitment to social justice. As Anastasiya said, we've got recommendations. We want to end the racism. We don't want to just talk about it and theorize. We actually want this to have an impact. We're also going to assume the centrality of experiential knowledge. And that's very important because when you privilege certain knowledges, and usually this is knowledges that that espouse a white normativity, a white privilege, they're highly academic, and it's not getting at the knowledge of people who are going through it. And so critical race theory does that. And for us, it's looking at the experience of athletes, right? And how important that is as a form of knowledge. And then the last part is what Anastasiya and I are practicing. Here we are embracing and entering a transdisciplinary, approach and perspective. So today we're doing an interdisciplinary, right? I had the privilege of looking at her data, and that's a very touchy thing if you know academics. We don't just give our data up. So I continue to thank Anastasiya for being open to allowing me to peer into her business, to look at her data and to take a look at it from my own perspective. So that's really giving you a sense of sport crit as I'm developing it more and more.
Great. I'm being mindful of time, so we will probably have to rush a little bit through the next section. But just to give you an overview, we're using some of the data from my PhD research. And for this case, we took 5 coaches in Europe, 5 white males who are coaches of professional basketball male teams in the Czech Republic, Germany, and Latvia. I've conducted some structured interviews for them, and then following the thematic analysis, figure out that there are several issues that coaches struggle with when they coach culturally diverse teams. And the main kind of thing that popped up was that they struggle with Black American players.
And so, you know, this is going to give you a sense of where we're going with the semi-structured interviews that we will present just pieces of them. So what immediately stood out when I looked at the data was that there is a clear hierarchy, that there is a sense that there is a difference in playing styles. And for me, it was interesting that they privileged this European style over an American style that these American players were bringing, right? So that stood out. And then, Anastasiya, you didn't even have a question that was specific to Blacks, and yet it came out, right?
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because my research wasn't even about the Black American players, but it turned out that all the coaches started talking about how they deal with Black American players.
And I didn't know at first whether, I said, you know, they're saying Americans, is that synonymous with Black? But they got specific to identifying Blacks, right? And so then we get into the negative stereotyping, some of the things you've already alluded to. And that for me was where it gets us back to this global idea of racism. So it's not just that there are individual coaches that might be, you know, have these bad perspectives. When you attach it to historical ideas of racism and Blacks as less than and lazy and so on, then you can see it in this larger institutionalized systemic way. And so that was really significant. And then the last part, every coach's job is to bring out the best in their players, to try to create this team. And so when you have these stereotypes, when you have these ideas of difference, how does that impact them bringing a team together? And they talk about that. So let's take a look at some of the examples. So we're going to go through, and you'll see we've got 5 coaches just to give you some examples. I'm going to highlight a piece of these things because I think we can talk about it a little bit more in the questions, right? But here you've got this idea of good character, right? Finding those with good character. And then in the second part of that, of just the first quote, because usually Black players come to Europe and go out to bars, having lots of attention from girls. We don't need that, right? And then, you know, here's a kind of a tough space that Black American male athletes are in, that here they are brought in to be this hero, right? To save these teams, to be ringers, if you will, to be the best. And they've got to carry the role of being the best and yet playing with players who may not be as good. So they're told you can teach everyone to play better, but you're not to humiliate them. Like, this is a fine line. So there's a uneven expectations, right? A double standard here. They are having to be players and yet teach and coach. They're supposed to be humble. They're not supposed to humiliate. And yet they live with this stereotyping that's already put on them, you know, that they may have bad character, right? So next slide, let's take a look at coach number 2, right? We get to this idea of style, right? They need to pass the ball. And yet at the same time, the last coach is talking about how they need to teach. So for me, there's this question of, well, why is one style better than the other? And who decides this, right? The power of that. Sometimes just for the sake of having ball, like all of this descriptors where they're judging these players and the way that they play, and yet they're still expected to be the star players. So how do you manage that, right? The high expectations while at the same time you better play a particular way. All right, let's look. So now we got Coach 5. Coach 5 talks about, you know, hey, we need them, right? They can quickly bring results. It's more attractive for fans, right? But, and there's almost always this but, right? There's this negative in how we're describing them. They lose interest in training very quickly. They think they already know better how to play and that they're too good to train hard, right? And so these are things that are attributed to Black players as though they are a monolith.
Yeah, and an interesting one is all about raising attractiveness, right? Oh, we have a Black player here. Yeah, fans will come and watch because, wow, that's interesting one. Yeah, go on.
one other piece, so that connects me to the work of Foer, who did the, how soccer explains the world. And he talked about it in terms of soccer or football, that in Eastern Europe, they would bring in an African player, a player of African descent, because that was known to prove that they were serious, right? So again, there's a global thing even across sport.
Yeah, just again, be mindful of time because I think we overrun quite a lot. You will all have the access to those quotes later, so I guess you can go through them. But I guess we have 2 last slides to summarize, so Scott.
All right. So how do we address this problem, right? We want to encourage coaches to think outside, to one, identify their white normativity, why they think their style is best, and how that impacts how they're seeing others, particularly Black American males who they're bringing in. We want them to stop the deficit thinking, right? We want them to stop seeing them as other and doing that othering, as Daniel talked about. This is in practice. We want them to look at their assets, right? They are bringing in these positive skills. You're bringing them in for a reason. It works against you to think about it in terms of that deficit, as well as how it hurts the player. Ultimately, all of this is to become anti-racist, right? And so we advocate, promote, mentor, for this to end, the racism we want to end. And so this is a push for a racial turn. It's not just about thinking of kind of culture. It's deeper than that here when we're talking about these Black American males. We want to look at race and racism.
Brilliant. And just briefly, what's next? I think a more longitudinal study would be great to kind of follow those players when they come from America to Europe. And it's all about education. All the coaches I talked to, again, they weren't evil people, but I think this education is very important in sport, for coaches, for other players, for journalists, for agents, more about maybe even self-reflection, who we are, how do we interact with other races. And we are in a position here as academics to actually get into, to voice those inequalities. So I think this is what we can do further on. And some references then later for you as well. And we're very sorry for overrunning, but hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
That's awesome. No problem. We actually have a few questions here. So we're actually going to start with our attendee. If you would also just state your name, I'm going to allow you to talk right now.
Hi, my name is Grace Athanas Linden. I really appreciate this presentation. It was really interesting. I actually kind of wanted to take a step back to one of your beginning slides and think about how ideas of Western femininity play into how sport organizations target players for sex testing. Thinking about Caster Semenya, for example, who doesn't have typical Western feminine features, and also the fact that it's when she wins over white women that it's humiliating, and that's when the red flags are raised.
Yeah, it's a great question, Grace. I'm working on another paper where I'm looking at Serena Williams, and I talk about this white victimization, as you point out, right? So that Serena, as she dominates the field, there's this white victimization, starting all the way back with Martina Hingis. Maria Sharapova, even in her autobiography, talks about when she first faced Serena and Venus, it was playing against these grown women. And so, to your point, there's definitely this white victimization that I call a part of this new race ball, which is kind of dealing with racism in sport and then this focus. And the targeting, Serena talks about, being tested often. And, what they said was it's actually not random testing. It is targeted testing. They said it was because of her health complications. But to your point, there's undoubtedly what we're seeing when you go back to Duty and you go back to Caster. These are the high profile cases, and they do seem to point to women of color from the global South. So it is intersectional, right? That men don't have to deal with this same kind of testing. It's not as invasive. And then it's not just that it's women, it's women of color, and as I'm highlighting, dark complexion, that this adds to it.
Perfect. Yeah, nothing to add from me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace.
Thanks for your question. All right, we've got time for another one. So I'm going to unmute you now and let us know your name when I allow you to talk.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, great. Well, sorry, this is a big question. So I'm asking from disciplines like sociology, anthropology, organizational culture studies. And the work I've been doing for quite a number of years now is looking at how, with increasing levels of emotional intensity in an environment, increasing dynamics and structures of particular kinds of violence tend to simply emerge. So the question has long been open as to whether competitive sporting practices in any way model, mirror, resonate with more obvious practices of organized violence. And I suppose alongside that, one of the biggest questions in studies of violence over the years has been a lack of agreement or a lack of consistency in definitions of what violence actually means. Now with racism, this is of course very important. So in approaching racism intersectionally, in what ways, either explicitly or implicitly, are you coming to understand what violence might mean in this work? And also what thoughts might you have about the possible tensions between competitive sport as a kind of symbolic violence and the environments in competitive sport that have an intensity that seems to prime them to consistently do much to support and little to challenge violences of various kinds. So there's kind of two big things there. One is the kind of what insights do you have about violence through this work? And secondly, what insights might you have about the tensions that come up in the relationship between competitive sport and environments which seem in and of themselves often to support particular kinds of violence?
Uh-huh. Anastasiya, I know you do.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I'm just looking at the counting down in 40 seconds.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one, and I think that's when I really miss not having people around me in the real conference to talk about it. So I guess we can maybe take it later on and discuss it. I will probably kind of want to talk a little bit more to you later on about this maybe different perception of racism that I have kind of seen from coaches, because many of them in this attitude, they have this sort of attitude because many of these countries in Europe didn't really have this imperial or colonial past. They don't think that they are racist. If that makes sense. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
I think just to be mindful of time, what I will say is, as a parent of Black children who go into sport, it's not unlike putting them in school, that we have to prepare our children for the violence. My daughter was targeted at an age of 8 or 9 by a white parent, a mother, during a soccer match where the mother was telling her daughter to elbow my daughter because she thought my daughter was too aggressive. And she came onto the field and repeatedly told her daughter to elbow my daughter. And so you're right, there's definitely forms of violence. What I tell you is we have to speak to our children about it when we are Black, just as we're telling them to be wary of the police. And here's how you need to approach the police when they stop you or when you see them. And here's what you need to worry about when you go into school. So these are normal things of violence that are all a part of living or being Black. So, there's more to talk about there, but you're absolutely right. This is a form of violence, and we live with it, and it has its impacts. There are things that as children, people still remember, when they're adults.
Just maybe to add to that, the players that I talked to, those Black American players, we didn't really talk about violence that much, but the only kind of experience one of those players had is that, for example, he was the first Black person in that little village that he played. And it wasn't the violent experience that he had, it was more about curiosity from people who wanted to touch him because he was the first Black person that they have ever seen.